Game number 4 of the FIDE World Chess Championship, we see a surprise by Liren on move number 5. Very early on in this opening. Knight f3, this is a ready system. Pawn to d5, pawn to e3. And this is a setup that a lot of players use in Blitz. Hikaru Nakamura plays this quite a bit. You'll see it in chess.com titled Tuesdays. A very slow opening for white, but it's sort of like playing the black pieces with colors reversed. So now this looks like what's called a Queen's Indian defense, but normally the Queen's Indian defense is for black. They'll go e6, b6. And in the post-game press conference, someone asked Liren about this and said, "You've played a couple offbeat systems so far. Do you plan to go more mainline?" And he mentioned that he likes the Queen's Indian defense for black. So this got him a Queen's Indian defense position up one tempo because he got to move first. Bishop f5. And this setup for black is ultra solid. This is sort of like the London system in reverse. So normally you see the London from the white point of view, but after e6, h6, move the bishop out, castle. This looks just like a London, but for black. Bishop e2, h6, bishop a3, and this is the new idea. It sort of pins the e-pawn to this bishop. It's not quite a pin, because black could play e6, but after bishop takes f8, now black has to take with either the king or the rook, and this loses castling rights. So it's just a little bit uncomfortable, and if you're in Gukesh's shoes, he said he had seen this idea before, this bishop a3 pinning the pawn, but that he was essentially on his own already at this point. So opening win for Liren surprises Gukesh on move 5, and Liren also said he looked at this position very heavily. So he's gotten everything he wanted out of the opening. Got his Queen's Indian, up a tempo, surprised Gukesh, and he's in a territory that he's studied quite a bit, whereas Gukesh D is on his own. Knight d7, and the idea here is the knight guards the bishop, so now Gukesh can play e6 and recapture with the knight on f8. Castle, e6, takes, on c4. So at this point, white has a very, very tiny advantage, maybe 0.1. So let's see if Liren can press that advantage. Knight d7, preparing to castle. Now a move like d4 here, this takes us into sort of standard queen's pawn type territory, and that's a decent option. But after c6, castle for black, everything is very close to equal. It's going to be extremely tough to push for a win here. So instead, Liren plays knight to c3, and he keeps the d pawn back, kind of keeping in this hyper-modern opening style and not pushing into a queen pawn position. Castle, c takes d5. Now here black has to take with the e pawn. If you don't take with the e pawn, then you have to take back with the knight. And this gives white actually a decent advantage. Queen coming out to b3, pressuring this pawn. So it's better for black to take with the pawn first and keep that knight on c3. The c3 knight is sort of a clumsy knight for white. Okay, pawn to b4. Now in these types of positions, I'm a little biased because I've played them from the white point of view and not so much from the black point of view. I think they're a little bit easier to play for white. The idea for white is let's push these queenside pawns and let's try to trade one of the queenside pawns for one of black's queenside pawns. So for example, if there was a pawn on b5 for white, a pawn on c6 for black, we want to trade those pawns. Black has to take back with the b pawn. And then in the end, that pawn on c6 will be the weakest pawn on the board. And white can play rook c1, attack the pawn, queen a4, attack the pawn, knight d4, attack the pawn. So white wants to use these two pawns to push up the board and target these three pawns. Now, from black's point of view, I don't know the plans very well. I think usually what black will do is try to get c5 in safely. So for example, b6, c5, and build a big center and play that way. c6, starting nice and solid, creating this pawn chain. Knight d4, poking at the bishop and also kind of eyeing the queenside pawns. Bishop back. Queen b3, eyeing this pawn, maybe looking at b5, but it's just a nice move. Connects the rooks, gets the queen on a good square. And notice here with the knight on d4, black cannot move the b pawn. No b6 or b5 because of knight takes c6. Knight e5. Now the knight guards this pawn, So the b pawn could potentially move. But one thing to keep in mind in these structures, the way to push for an advantage on the king side for white is to play pawn to f4. And both players mentioned this in the press conference after the game. f4 is a move that you have to constantly be looking at. Liren was looking at it every move. Gukesh was looking at it every move. Could f4 be played? In this position, f4 is a perfectly fine move. And this knight can either go back to d7 or out to g6. But it wasn't played yet. Pawn to a4. Rook to c8. Now here I was wondering what happens if b5 is played. Going for that pawn trade that we talked about. Well, this is good for black. After c5 and the knight retreats, now black has these two pawns in the middle controlling a ton of space. And there's the knight on e5 looking at this square, looking at c4, and this bishop could even plop into d3. So this actually gives black a clear advantage. So you got to be careful here still as white. You can't just start pushing these pawns and not pay attention to what's going to happen in response. So a5 was played. b6. b5 here is also interesting. The computer liked this move. It's double-edged though. It does create this weakness here. And Gukesh D might have been having flashbacks to game number 1 when he had a backward c-pawn. Because now Liren can start to bring pressure down the file. So instead he plays b6. And this is actually the more aggressive move, I think, because Gukesh wants to play c5. And now it's guarded by the b pawn. So after c5 takes, pawn takes back, we get that big center again for black. Okay, knight f3 played. Now this move is sort of showing that Ding doesn't want to press for an advantage anymore. He might feel that if he presses too hard in this position, Gukesh D starts to claim an advantage or gets the initiative. So he starts to offer trades with knight f3. Now, a more interesting line, I think, is bishop to a6. Poke at the rook. The rook moves to keep the c-pawn guarded. And now let's try this idea of f4. The only good move for black is knight back to g6. And after rook f to c1, you can start to feel there's some pressure here coming from white, right? We already have this tension. The bishop is cutting off the rook. Rook on the open file, knight on d4. Really just this knight is in the way at the moment. But this is a way I think that Liren could have said, okay, I got the pawn structure I wanted. My team and I have prepped this opening novelty. Now let's figure out, how do we push for the win? How do we keep increasing the pressure and making this position difficult for Gukesh to play? Instead, though, knight f3 played. Knight takes, bishop takes, and pawn d4. Now, the next few moves I'm going to go through pretty quickly because the players start to trade down. Knight e2, d takes e, bishop e4 offering a trade, rook d1 hitting the queen moves, takes, knight c3 offering another trade, rook to f to d8. Now keep in mind here, we're at move 23. The players technically cannot offer draws. It's against the rules until move 40. So that's a rule to make games more interesting. But these super GMs are very precise when it comes to sort of offering draws by moves on the board. And that's what's happening here. Knight takes e4, queen takes, h3, just making sure there's no back rank mate. c5 offering another trade. Takes, rook c1. So black has the passed pawn, but white just puts the pressure in front of it. And Gukesh says, I'm going to defend it from the side. So there's no intention at all of pushing this pawn. So really the pawn is stuck here. g3, f5. Gukesh is sort of showing that, hey, if you didn't play g3, I could press you a little bit with f4. But this was a surprising move. In terms of playing for the draw, it does open up the king a little bit. But no worries, Gukesh has everything under control. King h7 puts his own king in a pin, which is kind of interesting. Queen c4, queen back to d6, e4, and this is another grandmaster draw for trade. Rook e5, takes, pins the rook, queen d5, pinning the queen, another trade. Now we're in a rook and pawn endgame, which is really, really in draw territory. Moves the king up, and now we get this repetition. So that's game number 4. We have a draw. What do you think? Put in the comments. Who do you think is going to secure the next victory? I think today's game was probably a win for Gukesh D because he handled everything nicely, and now he gets white pieces in the next game. So let me know in the comments, who do you think will win the next one? Stay tuned on this channel for recaps after every game. Thanks for watching.